Good morning and welcome to This Week. Compromise or combat?
There's a stalemate. Let's not kid ourselves.
Creeping up on that fiscal cliff.
This is not a game. That offer yesterday was simply not serious.
As private talks seem to collapse, President Obama cranks up the public heat.
If Congress does nothing, you'll see your taxes go up on January 1st. That's a Scrooge Christmas.
Which side will blink? Or will a cliff dive cripple the economy? We'll ask our headliner, the president's point man, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. Plus, Susan Rice hits a Senate buzzsaw.
The concerns I have are greater today than they were before.
Susan Rice is extraordinary.
But does President Obama want to fight over his Secretary of State? And did Obama and Romney really bury the hatchet at that Oval Office lunch? All that and the rest of the week's politics on our Powerhouse Roundtable with Republican Congressman Tom Cole and Keith Ellison for the Democrats, former Romney advisor Dan Senor, former Obama auto czar Stephen Ratner, and ABC's own Cokie Roberts.
From ABC News, This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Reporting from ABC News headquarters, George Stephanopoulos.
Hello again. Washington back to work this week, but with just 30 days to go until America hits the fiscal cliff that could mean a tax increase for everyone, there is no sign that Congress and the White House are anywhere close to a deal. So let's get right to where this is all headed with the president's top negotiator, Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. Thanks for joining us again, Mr. Secretary. It sure sounds like those meetings you had on Capitol Hill this week did not go very well. Senator Mitch McConnell told the Weekly Standard that he burst into laughter when he heard your proposal. And we just heard Speaker of the House John Boehner said, let's not kid ourselves, there's a stalemate. So is there a stalemate? And did Mitch McConnell really laugh out loud when he heard your proposal?
George, I actually think that we're going to get there. I mean, just inevitably going to be a little political theater in this context. Sometimes that's a sign of progress. I think we're actually making a little bit of progress, but we're still some distance apart. But, what's at stake here is very important. Is what we're trying to do is to not just prevent a tax increase on 98% of Americans, and there's no reason why we can't do that, but we're trying to go beyond that and make sure we're doing something that's going to be good for the long-term future of the American economy. And I think we have a chance to do that.
But you say you're getting closer. They say you're getting much farther apart. They say this is not even a serious proposal. It was a proposal designed to fail.
Well, we think we have a very good plan, a very good mix of tax reforms that raise a modest amount of revenue on the wealthiest 2% of Americans, combined with very comprehensive, very well-designed, very detailed savings that get us back to the point where our debt is stable and sustainable. And if we can do that carefully, we can create some room to invest in things to make America stronger, like rebuilding America's infrastructure, helping Americans refinance their mortgages, some careful tax incentives for business investment. We think those are good investments in America, and we think we can afford them, and we should do that as part of a deal like this. That's what we think makes sense.
Let's look at an outline of what the Republicans said they heard in the meeting, your offer. $1.6 trillion in tax increases over the next 10 years, $50 billion in stimulus spending right now, $400 billion in unspecified Medicare cuts over the next 10 years, and then permanent authority to increase the debt limit. The president wants that authority. They look at that $1.6 trillion in revenue and say it's twice as much as you get from raising taxes on the wealthy, again, and much more than Democrats would ever accept in the Senate. That's why they say this is not serious.
Well, let me tell you what we propose, what we think makes sense. And let me start with part of what you said, which is how to make sure we're lifting the threat of default over the American economy, over the credit of the United States, over the savings of Americans. What we proposed is to take an idea that Senator McConnell proposed in the summer of 2011 and just extend that. And what that does is, again, lift the cloud of default over the economy, because the president has to periodically propose an increase in the debt limit, and Congress then has a chance to express its view to disapprove that. And it was a very smart way by a senator with impeccable Republican credentials to again lift this periodic threat of default for the American economy. And that's
he said he never intended it to be permanent.
But again, it was a good idea then. It's a good idea going forward. And again, it came from him. It wasn't our idea. That makes a lot of sense. Now, what you said that was not quite right is what we laid out for them is a detailed, comprehensive set of $600 billion of reforms in health programs, other government programs over 10 years, which are going to be tough, but we think they make sense. Now, they don't like all of those changes. They might want to go beyond that, might want to do some different things, but they have to tell us what those things are. Now, you're right on the revenue side. We're proposing to let rates go back to the Clinton levels on 2% of Americans. Again, that was a very good time for the American economy. We can That'd be a good thing to do, sensible economic policy. And we want to combine that with tax reforms that would limit deductions for the top 2% of Americans. There's no surprise in this. We've been proposing this for a very long time. The President campaigned on it, and I think that's where we're going to end up. And I think there's going to be very broad support from the business community and from the American people for an agreement with roughly that shape.
And when you talk about limiting the deductions, there have been proposals from Governor Romney during the presidential campaign, from other Republicans, to also limit deductions, maybe a $25,000 cap on deductions. When you talk about those limitations on deductions, do you include the charitable deduction and the home mortgage deduction?
Well, I think you're right to point out the essential problem in this, which is that if you try to limit deductions like what you said with the $25,000 cap, what you do is you end up hitting millions and millions, actually 17 million middle-class Americans. A huge part of the revenue comes from that basic fact, which we're not prepared to do. It completely eliminates the incentives for relatively wealthy Americans to give to charities. We don't think that makes sense. And if you protect charitable contributions, you lose a huge amount of additional revenue. So those proposals, they may be worth considering, but if you design them carefully, they don't raise anything close to the type of revenue you need to get us back to a fiscally responsible
You mentioned
position.
the charitable. Are you saying now the charitable deduction should be off the table?
What we propose, that we think is a better way to do it, which is we propose to a percentage limit on the value of all deductions and exclusions for 2% of Americans. And what that does is it preserves a very significant economic incentive, financial incentives for Americans to give to charities. And of course, that's very important to all universities across America, all hospitals, and millions of nonprofit entities across the country that depend on those giving. And we think that's a better way to do it. That slightly reduces the marginal benefit of the deduction, but it preserves a substantial incentive to give to charity. We think that's a better way to do it.
I think one of the things the Republicans want to know is if the president is still behind ideas that he has seemed to back in the past. For example, gradually raising the eligibility age for Medicare, this adjustment in Social Security payments, the so-called chained CPI, which would adjust the cost of living adjustments over time for people on Social Security. Is the president still behind those ideas?
There's a lot of ideas out there, George, from Democrats and Republicans of other things we can do to help strengthen Medicare and strengthen Social Security. And, what I can do is to tell you the merits of the specific things we propose, which again are very substantial savings over 10 years, $600 billions of dollars. And when Republicans come to us and say we'd like to do something different or beyond that, we'll take a look at how to do that. And if it meets our basic values and our test, then we'll give it a serious consideration.
So you're even willing to consider new restrictions on Social Security because people like Senator...
No, I didn't say that. Let me clarify that. Thank you for asking me that. What the president is willing to do is to work with Democrats and Republicans to strengthen Social Security for future generations so Americans can approach retirement with dignity and with the confidence they can retire with a modest guaranteed benefit. But we think you have to do that in a separate process so that our seniors don't face the concern that we're somehow going to find savings in Social Security benefits to help reduce the other deficits.
So to be clear, that is one thing that is clearly off the table. Social Security is off the table in these negotiations.
Well, we're prepared to, in a separate process, look at how to strengthen Social Security, but not as part of a process to reduce the other deficits the country faces.
Okay, so that sounds like a yes to that question. Well, on the issue of taxes, is there any flexibility in the president's position? Does it have to go all the way back, the tax rates on the wealthy, all the way back to the Clinton rates? Or is there some kind of formula below those Clinton rates that is still a tax rate hike that the president can accept?
Well, again, George, we think the best way to do this, and this is what we propose, is have those tax rates go back to where they were at one of the best, most prosperous times in recent American economic history. And then to combine that with reforms that limit deductions for the top 2% of Americans. We think that's the best way to do that. I'm deeply skeptical about ways to get through this without that mix of rates and reforms.
And if Congress doesn't agree to have those rates go up, you're comfortable with the idea of going over that cliff on January 1st?
Look, there's a huge amount at stake here in this context, George, and there's just no reason why 98% of Americans have to see their taxes go up because some members of Congress on the Republican side want to block tax rate increases for 2% of the wealthiest Americans. Remember, those tax rates, those tax cuts cost $1 trillion over 10 years. There is no responsible way we can govern this country at a time of enormous threat and risk and challenge uncertainty, millions of Americans retiring, huge levels of poverty, inequality, huge underinvestment in education infrastructure, with those low rates in place for future generations. Those rates are going to have to go up. That's an essential part of it.
But as you know, a lot of Democrats think if the Republicans do indeed dig in on those tax rates, it is far preferable to go over the cliff than to reach a different kind of deal. Do you agree?
I don't think that's going to happen. It certainly doesn't need to happen, and we're going to work very hard to make sure it doesn't happen. And what we're going to try to do is, again, not just protect the vast bulk of Americans for that kind of tax increase and the other damage that would come from the fiscal cliff, but we're going to try to do something good for the long-term health of the country.
What would happen to the economy if we do go over the cliff?
You know, it would be very damaging to average Americans. There's no doubt about it. But there's no reason why it has to happen. And again, we're going to work very hard to prevent it. And the only reason that would happen, again, is if a small group of members of Congress decide they're going to block an agreement because they're not prepared to see tax rates rise modestly for just 2% of the wealthiest Americans.
Mr. Secretary, I hear you say you're going to work very hard, but boy, you listen to every Republican coming out of the meetings with you this week. They're saying you're going backwards, not forwards. So what is the specific next step to get this back on track? Is the president ready to meet face-to-face with the Speaker, face-to-face with the Republican leader in the Senate to try to nail this down?
Well, of course he is. And we'll do that when it makes sense. And at this point, though, you got to recognize that they're in a very difficult place. And they recognize they're going to have to move in a bunch of things, but they don't know really how to do it yet and how to get support for the members on the Republican side. And so what we're going to do is continue to explore ways we can solve this problem. But ultimately, they have to come to us and tell us what they think they need. What we can't do is to keep guessing about what works for their politics.
So the ball is in their court?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And they understand that. And, you know, when they come back to us and say, we'd like you to consider this and we'd like you to consider that, we'll take a look at that.
Finally, one final question. This is your last assignment for the president, wrapping up these negotiations. So how much longer do you think you're going to be staying? And also, it was interesting to see this week that Warren Buffett thinks your best replacement would be Jamie Dimon, the head of J.P. Morgan.
I think Jamie Dimon actually would be, I think he'd be terrific because I think he, if we did run into problems in markets, I think he would actually be the best person you could have in the job.
Any chance of that?
George, the president's going to choose somebody very talented to lead the Treasury for his next 4 years. And I'm very fortunate I've been able to work with him to help solve these problems of the country over this period of time. And I'm very confident he's going to have somebody in place in January to succeed me.
I didn't think you were going to bite on that, but thanks for your time this morning. Mr. Secretary, thanks very much.
Thanks, George.